They say a mother's love for her child is unconditional, that nothing in the world can break the bond between them. But what if everything you thought you knew about love and trust could be shattered in an instant? What if the unthinkable happened, and a mother, someone who should be the protector, turns out to be the very person who destroys the life of the one they should love the most? This is the story of one mother, a woman who appeared to have everything: a perfect life, a successful career, and a beautiful family. But behind closed doors, she harbored a darkness so deep that it would lead her to commit the unthinkable: the shocking murder of her own child in cold blood. When Sarah Matthews, a respected school teacher and mother of two, was arrested for the brutal murder of her 8-year-old daughter, Emily, the world was left in shock. The once picture-perfect family had been torn apart, and the community was left to ask one question: how could a mother do such a thing? Sarah Matthews, a woman who had been admired by her friends, colleagues, and neighbors, was the last person anyone would suspect of being capable of such a heinous crime. But the truth, as it often does, began to unravel in the most disturbing way imaginable. It all started with a call to 911, a call that would change everything. On that fateful evening, Sarah's frantic voice echoed through the phone lines, her words rushed and panicked. "My daughter. She's not breathing. Please, you have to help her." When the paramedics arrived at the Matthews home, they were met with a scene so chilling it would haunt them forever. Emily was lying motionless on the living room floor, her small body bruised and lifeless. There were no signs of an intruder, no signs of struggle, just a mother in tears, desperately begging for help. But something was off. As the paramedics worked to resuscitate Emily, they noticed Sarah standing at the doorway, frozen in place, her eyes empty, as if she had already resigned herself to the horror that had unfolded. As the investigation began, the details of Emily's death only grew more disturbing. Autopsy reports revealed that the little girl had been suffocated, strangled with a pillow, the marks on her neck clear and unmistakable. But that wasn't the worst part. The coroner's report indicated that the cause of death was not just a spontaneous act of violence. It was methodical, deliberate, and cold. Sarah Matthews had planned this out. It wasn't the first time Emily had been the victim of violence in the Matthews home. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices, arguments, and sometimes even screams coming from the house. But no one ever suspected that something so horrific would happen. No one suspected that the loving mother everyone knew could be capable of such a monstrous act. As Sarah sat in the interrogation room, the police tried to piece together the events leading up to the night of the murder. They learned that, on the surface, Sarah's life seemed perfect. She was a teacher at a well-regarded local school, a woman who was admired for her work with children and her dedication to her family. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to show. A closer look revealed that Sarah had been under immense pressure, both at home and at work. Her husband, Mark Matthews, had been working long hours at his corporate job, leaving Sarah to handle everything at home. Emily, their youngest daughter, had been a challenge in recent months. She had been acting out at school, and Sarah's patience had worn thin. But none of that could explain the horror that took place that night. No one could understand why Sarah would turn on her own flesh and blood. Then came the shocking revelation. In the months leading up to Emily's death, Sarah had begun visiting a psychiatrist. The visits were initially for stress, for her difficulty coping with family life. But the more the investigators dug into Sarah's medical history, the more they uncovered. It wasn't just stress that had brought Sarah to seek help. It was a deepening mental illness, one that had been masked by her outward appearance of control and perfection. Sarah had been diagnosed with a personality disorder, a condition that often leads to erratic behavior, emotional instability, and a deep sense of entitlement. She had long struggled with feelings of inadequacy and failure, particularly when it came to being a mother. Her sessions with the psychiatrist revealed that she had been grappling with an overwhelming sense of rejection from her family, particularly Emily, who had been displaying behavioral issues. But none of this explained the calculated, brutal act of murder that she had committed. As the investigation continued, a crucial piece of evidence emerged: a hidden journal found in Sarah's bedroom. In it, Sarah had written about her fears of losing control of her family, her life, and her place in the world. She had written about feeling trapped in her role as a mother and wife, unable to live up to the expectations placed on her. And as the entries became darker, it was clear that Sarah's thoughts had turned twisted. She had begun to view Emily not as her daughter, but as a threat, someone who was taking away her sense of power, her freedom. "I've tried to be a good mother," Sarah had written, "but I can't keep pretending. She's pushing me too far. She doesn't respect me. She never will." The pieces were falling into place. Sarah Matthews had killed her own daughter not just out of frustration, but because she had become obsessed with maintaining control over her life and her family. Emily, in her eyes, had become an obstacle, one she could no longer tolerate. The plan was cold, calculated, and executed with chilling precision. But as Sarah sat in the courtroom, facing the consequences of her actions, the question remained: what drove this once perfect woman to murder her own child? Was it the pressure of family life? Was it a deeper, more profound darkness inside her? Or was it something else, something more insidious that had been lying dormant for years? Sarah Matthews' trial is still ongoing, but the evidence against her is overwhelming. As the jury deliberates, the public waits, torn between sympathy for a woman driven to the edge by mental illness and outrage at the horrific crime she committed. And yet, as the final verdict looms, one question remains unanswered: will justice truly be served? As the trial of Sarah Matthews continued, the full extent of her mental illness came to light. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Rebecca Porter, took the stand to testify. Dr. Porter, who had treated Sarah for nearly a year, provided a chilling portrait of a woman consumed by an inner turmoil so profound that it left her incapable of empathy or even basic moral understanding. According to Dr. Porter, Sarah's condition had worsened over time. The diagnosis of a personality disorder had been compounded by feelings of failure and resentment towards her family. She had grown obsessed with the idea that Emily was somehow a threat to her power, to her ability to control her life. But Dr. Porter's testimony also revealed something more troubling. Sarah had confessed, during a therapy session, that she had felt no love for Emily in the last few months before her death. "I never wanted her," Sarah had confessed to Dr. Porter, her voice hollow. "I just don't know how to be her mother. She's too much. She's always getting in my way. I've been trying so hard to keep everything together, but she makes it harder. She's a little monster." Sarah's words sent a ripple through the courtroom. For the first time, the true nature of her feelings toward her daughter became clear. Emily, in Sarah's eyes, had become the embodiment of all her fears and insecurities. The loving mother figure that Sarah had once presented to the world was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. Beneath it, there was a woman who was unraveling, consumed by jealousy and resentment, feelings so intense that they ultimately led to the unthinkable. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Sarah had not acted alone in her descent into madness. The pressure had been mounting for months, but Sarah's husband, Mark Matthews, had been too caught up in his own career to notice. Sarah had long since stopped confiding in him, and their marriage had deteriorated into something empty and strained. Mark had worked long hours at his corporate job, leaving Sarah to manage the house and raise their two children. But instead of being a source of support, he had become a distant figure in Sarah's life. When Mark took the stand, his testimony painted a picture of a man who had never truly understood his wife's struggles. He was shocked and horrified by the murder, but there was a sense of disbelief in his voice. Mark had never suspected that Sarah could harm Emily. He admitted to being blind to the cracks in their marriage, believing that everything would somehow work itself out. His inability to see the warning signs, to be the partner that Sarah needed, had allowed the darkness to fester in the background of their lives. But just when the pieces of Sarah's life seemed to fall into place, a shocking twist turned the investigation upside down. During the trial, a former colleague of Sarah's, Julia Harris, came forward with disturbing information. Julia had worked with Sarah for years at the local elementary school, and she had witnessed subtle signs of Sarah's unraveling. She had noticed the small cracks in Sarah's perfect persona, the way she seemed to snap under pressure, the way her temper flared during casual conversations. But Julia had never imagined that Sarah's issues would lead to something this horrific. Julia's testimony was unsettling. She revealed that, months before the murder, Sarah had made strange comments about her daughter. "I can't stand the way she looks at me," Sarah had said during one of their conversations. "She's always making me feel like I'm failing her, and I don't know how to fix it." The more Julia spoke, the clearer it became that Sarah had been spiraling into a dangerous place, a place where she was unable to distinguish between reality and her delusions. She had no ability to see the love her family had for her. Instead, she viewed every aspect of her life, her husband, her children, as obstacles standing in the way of her own success and sense of self-worth. In the twisted reality Sarah had created, Emily was no longer her daughter. She was a threat to be eliminated. But Julia's testimony was not the only shocking revelation. Another piece of the puzzle was about to emerge from the shadows. While Sarah had tried to maintain control over her family, one thing had remained out of her reach: her daughter's social circle. Emily had confided in her school friends and teachers about the growing tension in her home. She had mentioned on several occasions that her mother had started acting strangely, as if something was wrong with her. One teacher, Mrs. Collins, testified that Emily had been scared in the days leading up to her death. "She told me that her mother didn't love her anymore," Mrs. Collins said, her voice trembling as she recalled the last conversation she had with Emily. She said her mother was different, colder. She said she was afraid to go home. These statements, spoken innocently by a young child, became haunting in hindsight. Emily had known. Emily had sensed the shift in her mother's behavior long before it had escalated to murder. She had been scared for her life, and yet, no one had known how serious her fears really were. But there was one final piece to the puzzle, one final revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom: Emily's last words. In the final moments before she died, Emily had said something that would haunt Sarah forever. "I know you don't love me. I know you hate me. But I still love you, Mom. Please don't hurt me." Those words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Emily had known the truth about her mother, and in her final moments, she had still tried to reach out. But Sarah had been beyond the point of no return. The hatred, the resentment, the mental illness, everything had built up to this one tragic moment. As the trial drew to a close, the question remained: was Sarah Matthews truly the victim of a mental illness, a woman driven to commit the unthinkable by forces beyond her control? Or was she simply a woman who had lost her way, a woman who allowed her darkness to consume her until it destroyed the one thing she was meant to protect? As Sarah Matthews sits in the courtroom, awaiting the jury's verdict, the truth is clear. This is not just a story about a mother who killed her child. This is the story of a woman who allowed herself to be consumed by obsession, power, and betrayal. And as the jury deliberates, the question still lingers: will justice be served? Or will Sarah Matthews find a way to escape the consequences of her actions? The jury had been deliberating for hours. The evidence was undeniable. Sarah Matthews had murdered her daughter. But there was still one lingering question that had yet to be answered. Was she truly guilty of murder? Or was she a victim of her own mind, driven to violence by a mental illness that had consumed her? The defense had argued that Sarah's actions had been the result of her deteriorating mental state. The prosecution, however, had painted a very different picture, one of a calculated and cold mother who had chosen her own selfish desires over the life of her child. Sarah sat motionless in the courtroom, her face expressionless. Her once perfectly maintained appearance now looked haggard and broken. The woman who had once been the picture of grace and professionalism was now a shadow of herself. And as the clock ticked down, the weight of the decision that lay ahead seemed to press down on everyone in that room. The jury filed back into the courtroom, and the tension was unbearable. Sarah's family sat in the front row, their faces a mix of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. Mark Matthews, her estranged husband, sat with his head bowed, his mind reeling from the realization that his wife had murdered their child. He had failed to see the signs. He had failed to protect Emily. And now, the truth was crashing down on him. The judge called the court to order. The room fell silent as the jury foreman stood, holding the fate of Sarah Matthews in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Matthews, guilty of first-degree murder." The words echoed in the courtroom like a death knell. Sarah's face remained emotionless, but inside, she was a storm of confusion and rage. Her world had just collapsed in an instant. She had murdered her daughter, but now, the weight of that verdict hung heavily over her. She had tried to convince herself that her actions were justified, that she had been pushed too far, but in the end, there was no escaping the truth. She had taken the life of the one person she was meant to protect. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of her actions finally began to hit home. The courtroom was filled with whispers, people discussing her cold, calculated crime, questioning how a mother could commit such an act. Emily's family, devastated by the loss of the little girl they had once known, struggled to make sense of it all. They knew Sarah had her issues, but they never imagined it could have led to this. Could Sarah have been saved? Could anyone have done anything to stop this from happening? These were questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But Sarah's fate was not sealed with the verdict alone. There was more to her story, more to her motivations than anyone realized. As she sat in the holding cell, preparing for the inevitable sentencing, something occurred to her, something that would change everything. She had been accused of murdering Emily, and now she would face the consequences. But what if there was more at play? What if her actions had been part of a much larger, more twisted plan, a plan that even she hadn't fully understood until now? In the final moments before the sentencing, Sarah began to see things in a new light. She was no longer the victim of her own mental illness. She was no longer the perfect mother, the victim of a system that had failed her. No, she had been something worse. She had been a player in a game of manipulation, a game she had lost. What no one knew was that in the days leading up to Emily's death, Sarah had been making secret plans. Hidden within her diary, now uncovered by investigators, was a final chilling entry that seemed to come from someone entirely different. Someone who had accepted the darkness within her and was prepared to embrace it fully. "I've made my choice," Sarah had written. "I can't go back now. I've been a mother, I've been a wife, and now I'm nothing. But I can be something more. I will take everything. It's all mine now. And when they find her, they'll never understand. I'm in control." The last words Sarah had written were as chilling as they were ominous. It became clear that Sarah had never truly been the victim of her own illness. She had been a woman obsessed with power, with control. Her obsession with maintaining her perfect image had led her to a path of destruction that she could no longer undo. She had killed Emily not just because of her frustrations, but because Emily had become a threat to the control Sarah so desperately sought. The trial had ended, but Sarah's reckoning was far from complete. Her sentence was handed down swiftly, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But even as she sat in that cold, sterile cell, she remained eerily calm. Was it remorse she felt? Was it guilt? Or was it simply a deep acceptance that she had done what she had to do? In the aftermath of the trial, the Matthews family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Mark Matthews, Emily's father, could never fully come to terms with the horror that had been inflicted on their family. The trauma of losing a child was unimaginable, but to lose her to the very person who was supposed to protect her, to love her, was a pain that would never heal. And yet, as Sarah Matthews sat in prison, the darkness that had once consumed her was finally starting to fade. But the legacy of her actions would live on, haunting the Matthews family for generations. For Emily's death was not just a tragedy. It was a warning of the destructive power of obsession and the human capacity for cruelty. As Sarah's story comes to an end, we are left to question, what drives a person to such madness? Is it a deeply buried darkness within, waiting to be unleashed? Or is it something more, a breakdown of the human mind under pressure, the weight of control, the obsession with perfection? The case of Sarah Matthews will continue to haunt those who followed it. The question of whether justice was truly served will linger long after the final gavel fell. And as we reflect on this chilling case, we are reminded of one simple truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most perfect. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. If you were shocked by this story, you're not alone. The darkest truths often lie behind the most flawless facades. Stay tuned for more disturbing true crime stories. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories.